I guess it's going to be a week 6, day 2. Going to be talking about the politics and the war when it comes to the Civil War. You know, what's going on in the war behind the scenes besides actual battles. Right. We got a couple pictures here to start out with. One is going to be just a picture of Abraham Lincoln. Cameras are starting to come out in the 1850s, 1860s. So this idea of actually being able to take pictures and having them is very new. It's not like today with our phones where you can take pictures of anything at any time. Right? But having a picture of Abraham Lincoln, like literally at the battlefield, is very rare. Another thing that was very famous besides pictures of people, pictures of a battlefield afterwards. And these pictures would be sold as if they were just artwork at that point. Because it was very rare to have them. It's not something that everyone had. It's not like today when you go in a house, there's pictures everywhere. You know, if you could have a picture of your family or of a loved one in your house in the 1860s, 1870s, that was a big deal because you had to hire someone, and it took time to develop these photos. Right? So first slide here, when it comes to politics, we're talking about what's called the writs of habeas corpus. This is a Latin legal term, which basically means right now, if you ever got arrested, you'd have to see a judge before you went to jail. You know, that applies to everyone in our country. Okay? The reason we're going to mention this is because right before the Civil War and during the Civil War, Lincoln actually suspends the writs of habeas corpus in some border states. Okay? You could consider this illegal within reason because, you know, suspending someone's rights is technically illegal. That's like if someone tried to suspend the right of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, you know, there'd be a big uproar. Right? Border states are going to be states that are between the North and South. So the North, you have the blue here. The South, you have the yellow. But then you have like this greenish area here. They're border states because they're states that joined the Union but still had slavery. Okay? So you have the southern states that had slavery that are fighting against the Union. Then you had some border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, which will actually fight for the Union, but they'll still have slavery during the war. Okay? And the reason he makes writs of habeas corpus, he suspends it, is because if you don't know, Washington, D.C. is located approximately in this area right here, where I'm got the mouse kind of circling. Okay? If Maryland, it's located between Maryland and Virginia. If Maryland would have joined the Confederacy, that means the Union capital of Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by Southern forces or the Confederacy. Right? So what Lincoln does is he suspends writs of habeas corpus when Maryland decides to be part, whether to be part of the Union or part of the Confederacy. Everyone that would be part of the Confederacy or would have voted to be part of the Confederacy was going to be put in jail. So when they take that vote, they'll vote to join the Union because all Confederate supporters were in jail, and they could go to jail right away because writs of habeas corpus, again, was suspended. Again, very controversial in this time period. You can't do that, but Lincoln does it, and you know it's a pretty smart move, but again, you know, questionable when it comes to legality of what's going on there. Right. Another thing that's going to go on during the war is there's going to be a draft in the North. Okay, the Union will put a draft. There's a draft today. Once you turn 18, you're automatically enrolled in it. You don't get a choice. You're there. Right? Back then, the draft starts in the 1860s to increase the size of the military, just like any draft would today. Okay? The biggest thing about this draft is the draft actually will favor the rich. So if you're able to afford $300 back then, you could avoid the draft. So say Coach Weir got drafted, and they come to my house, and they go, all right, Coach Beer, you can either be drafted or give us $300 to get out. Well, today, if I'd probably just give $300 because $300 today isn't a lot of money. But back then, $300 is considered, you know, it's similar to like $30,000 today. You know, it's a lot of money. You know, if someone came to my house today and said, hey, you can join the draft or get $30,000, I'd be like, okay, I'll just go get my bag because I don't have $30,000 laying around. Okay? So the rich people were able to afford this, and of course, the ones who are going to end up fighting the war are going to be the poor. Okay? And it's going to be made up of poor people and also immigrants coming off the boat. You know, a lot of immigrants actually just join right when they get into America because it's guaranteed food and guaranteed money. And this is going to these drafts will lead to draft riots, the most famous being in New York City in 1863, where a good portion of the city is actually burned. If you want to see what the draft riot looks like, if you actually watch the movie, it's called Gangs in New York with Leonardo DiCaprio, Cameron Diaz, and Daniel Day-Lewis, very famous movie. They show you kind of give you a visual of what the draft riots look like in New York City. It was so bad that the Union Navy actually opens fire into the city to try to put some of the riots down because it got so out of control at that time. Another thing very famous, probably the most famous thing that happens during the war besides the actual battles, is what's called the Emancipation Proclamation. You probably heard about it before. It's going to be written by Lincoln. And what the Emancipation Proclamation does, it basically says, hey, it says to the South, if you come back now, you can keep your slaves and, we'll forget things happen. So it gives them almost an ultimatum. Okay, come back, join the Union now, come back. We'll kind of forget what happened, and then you can keep your slaves. However, Lincoln will say, after this time period at such and such date, if you do not return, okay, we are fighting to free your slaves. And some will be like, well, the South's not a part of the North. How could they free the slaves? It's the idea that, remember, the initial part of the war was to preserve the Union. And then the war and the Emancipation Proclamation is going to change the war from preserving the Union to freeing slaves. Okay, and Lincoln said, when we win, we're going to free your slaves and you won't be able to keep them at all. Okay, again, it makes the war about slavery. And the biggest thing, it prevents the South from gaining allies, specifically England. It's going to be really tough for a foreign country to defend the South if the war is about slavery, especially if your country is against slavery. Okay, imagine today if there was slavery existing in a country somewhere, say in Africa or Asia or wherever, and the United States supports that country that is fighting, and they have slavery. Well, there would be a huge uproar in our country because we'd be like, well, slavery is illegal. Why are we supporting this country that has slavery? Same thing back then. England's going to be like, well, we can't support this country who's basically trying to fight to keep slaves when we don't have slavery ourselves. It's not going to go well when it comes to public opinion at home. And another thing the Emancipation Proclamation does is because it's fighting to free slavery, you're going to have African Americans join the war. Almost 250,000 African Americans join the Union to help fight the war. Think about it. If you're a runaway slave or if you're an African American and you had family down south, you literally, if you're fighting the war, you're fighting for their freedom. You're fighting to free maybe family members you haven't seen in a long time. And that's going to be a motivation for African Americans to join, is to end slavery, to help family members or people like themselves to gain freedom. Another thing comes out because of you have African Americans join, you can have the first all African American units. One of the most famous ones that we talk about is going to be the 54th Massachusetts, and mainly because they're famous. I guess it's all famous right there. But maybe they're famous for storming Fort Wagner in Charleston. Their battle existed in South Carolina, so it pertains to South Carolina history. And the movie Glory is based off of them. So again, you have African Americans join the war because of the Emancipation Proclamation. They're going to form all African American groups, and then one of the most famous one is the 54th Massachusetts, which is famous for storming Fort Wagner in Charleston in the 1860s. And then the next one here is going to be Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. This is where Robert E. Lee will surrender to Ulysses S. Grant in Virginia to effectively end the Civil War. Yes, Johnston will be kind of running around, being followed by Sherman for a while afterwards. But when Robert E. Lee surrenders, people realize that the war is coming to an end and the North is going to win. Okay, and you got Robert E. Lee here in the gray, Ulysses S. Grant. They actually did a really good three-part biopic on Ulysses S. Grant and his life leading up to and actually during the Civil War. Okay, he actually fights. He's the general of the Union Army that fights to free slaves. Right? And interesting story about this surrender is that Robert E. Lee is actually allowed to keep his sword. Usually when you surrender, you present your sword as the form of surrendering. Ulysses S. Grant has respect for him and lets him keep it. And then also when Robert E. Lee leaves the courthouse, the Union soldiers that are out there will salute him as he leaves. Because again, Robert E. Lee actually fights for the United States in the War of Mexico. He's a very famous military leader. He's respected among ranks, even in the North and South. So when he surrenders and walks out, then the Union Army will actually salute him as a sign of respect. Right? And because of this surrendering and the end of the Civil War, right after the Civil War ends, we're going to enter a time period known as Reconstruction, where we're going to try to rebuild the South economically because a lot of cities have been destroyed, factories and towns and railroads and farms and so forth, and also reconstruct the South politically because, we have to figure out how do we bring the South back into the United States. They've been gone for 4 years. How do we bring them back into Congress? How do we bring them back in the Senate and the House of Representatives? What are the rules behind it? And that's going to be the huge debate between 1865 and 1877 after the Civil Wars. How do we move forward as a country to kind of put this event of the Civil War behind us? Okay, and that'll be it for this week. And I hope you guys, again, as always, have a good day.